The sun hadn't risen when they dragged Sarah through the cold stone corridors. No screaming, no pleading, just the sound of bare feet on wet stone, and the heavy silence of someone who already understood that protest would change nothing. They locked her in the pack prison for crossing a forbidden courtyard, a courtyard no one had warned her about. An accident, or so she thought. But on the second morning, a wolf cub appeared at her cell, and in its mouth was the Alpha King's darkest secret, a secret that could bring down the entire pack. And Sarah, an Omega with calloused hands and a scribe's sharp mind, had to decide, stay silent and survive, or speak and change everything. The pack kingdom of Valdenmoor sat at the crossroads of 3 mountain ranges, how where the wind came in cold off the peaks and the great walled stronghold of the Ironmark pack rose above the valley like a second fortress built to make the sky feel small. Sarah had worked within those walls for 2 years, 23 years old. Dark hair tied back with a plain cloth, hands roughened by seasons of tending the pack's inner gardens, eyes the color of dark honey, eyes that had seen enough grief not to be easily startled by more. She was the daughter of Aldrich, a royal scribe who had died 2 winters ago, leaving her only his name, his gift for letters, and a debt to the pack house that required her service in the estate gardens. She was not a bonded servant, but not fully free either. She existed in the space between, invisible enough to be ignored, present enough to be punished. And punished she was. The accusation was almost darkly comic. The previous afternoon, carrying a basket of herbs for the estate kitchen, Sarah had crossed the council yard, the sacred deliberation space where the Alpha King's lords assembled, forbidden to any woman outside the inner chambers. She hadn't known. No one had warned her. The usual path was blocked by repair work, and another garden worker had pointed her toward a shortcut, without mentioning the prohibition. But in the Ironmark pack, ignorance of pack law was not an excuse, especially when someone wanted to use the law as a weapon. And someone did. What Sarah didn't yet know was that the shortcut had not been suggested by accident. The other worker had been instructed, by a name Sarah would only learn later. Lord Brennan, the pack's senior council lord. In the cold, a damp cell that smelled of old straw and wet stone, Sarah didn't know any of that. She simply sat on the floor, pressed her back against the wall, folded her hands in her lap, and breathed. One long, deliberate breath, the kind that says, "I will not break." Riva, the elderly guardian of the female holding ward, watched all of this from the iron gate. She had kept this post for nearly 30 years. She had seen women enter screaming, praying, fainting, begging. She had seen very few enter in silence. This one unsettled her from the first moment. "You're not going to cry," Riva muttered, half to herself. Sarah looked up. No rage in her eyes. Something more clarifying, or more dangerous depending on how you read it. Lucidity. "Cry to whom?" she said quietly. "The walls don't hear me. And you, Ureva, you've heard too much weeping to care about more." The old woman opened her mouth, closed it, and for the first time in a very long time, had nothing to say. Sarah didn't sleep that night. Not from fear, from thought. Her father had trained her since childhood to read what others overlooked. Details, patterns, the shape of a thing beneath its surface. She turned the previous day over in her mind like a stone in her hands. Why that path? Why that particular worker who suggested it? Why was the punishment so immediate, so disproportionate? Crossing a restricted area by accident warranted a reprimand, a docked wage, not imprisonment. Someone wanted her here. The conclusion arrived quietly, but with the weight of certainty. And with it, something she hadn't expected to feel on a cold prison floor. Not despair, determination. The wolf cub appeared on the second morning. Sarah was kneeling near the high wall slit, trying to warm her hands in the thin thread of early light, when she heard it. Not the clumsy tumbling of the young pups that sometimes wandered the lower palace grounds. Something slower, more deliberate. It squeezed through the iron gate bars with the boneless ease of the very young. A pack wolf cub, no more than 4 months old, slate gray with pale amber eyes that studied the cell with the focused calm of an animal that had already decided something before arriving. In its mouth was a scroll. Sarah didn't move. Instinct, a sudden movement would startle it. So she stayed still, breathing slowly, watching until the cub, as if it had made a private decision about her, set the scroll down on the stone floor. Then it sat back and looked at her. The scroll was small, folded many times, bound with a fraying red thread, as though it had been carried some distance before arriving here. Sarah held the cub's gaze for a long moment. In the Ironmark pack, the Alpha's wolves, the great animals bonded to the ruling bloodline, were known to roam freely through the stronghold's upper levels, including the Council Tower, where the Alpha King held his most private meetings. The pack wolves went where no common person dared follow. They were fed by the household keepers, regarded as protectors and omens in equal measure. She reached for the scroll slowly, untied the thread the way her father had taught her to treat any document, with patience, with care, with attention to what it was about to reveal. She unfolded it. Read it once. Read it again. On the third reading, her hands stopped moving. It was not an ordinary letter. It was a confirmation, a reply to something already arranged, written in the layered, oblique language that experienced scribes use to disguise meaning. But to someone raised between ink and manuscripts, it was transparent as water. The writer confirmed that the northern gate guards would be replaced by loyal men on the appointed night, that the gift would arrive at its destination before dawn, that the arrangements were in place, and at the bottom, a single line that turned Sarah's blood cold. The pack needs a new alpha. The current one no longer leads, he only consumes. No name signed, but pressed faintly into the lower corner of the paper, a seal. Small, almost invisible. Almost. Sarah knew it. Her father had described every symbol of Ironmark authority, for the way he described constellations, so she would never be lost, no matter where she found herself. It was the seal of Lord Brennan, the king's own senior council lord. Sarah sat for a long time with the scroll in her hands. Outside, the pack stronghold was waking. She could hear the distant calls of the morning market below the walls, the faint sound of the pack horn marking the dawn watch change, the muffled rhythm of a world that didn't know what was sleeping at its center. She knew what the scroll meant. This was not a political argument, not ordinary court scheming. Someone was planning to kill Alpha King Daven Ironmark, and the man behind it was the lord who governed in his name. Riva appeared with the morning ration, hard bread and water, and found Sarah standing at the gate with an expression the old woman had never seen on any prisoner. Not fear, not resignation. The face of someone who has just understood that fate has placed something enormous in their hands and is deciding what to do with the weight. Riva. Sarah's voice was low and steady. I need you to do something for me. The old woman narrowed her eyes. Prisoners don't make requests. I know, Sarah said. That's why I'm not asking as a prisoner. I'm asking as the only person in this stronghold who knows something that could change everything. A pause. I need to speak with the Alpha King. Today, before nightfall. Riva exhaled through her nose. You know what happens to prisoners who request audience with the king? I know, Sarah said, and without blinking. The same thing that happens to a pack when no one warns the Alpha that someone is coming for his life. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. It was enough to change everything. Alpha King Davon Ironmark was not an easy man to surprise. He had taken the Alpha mantle at 19, had navigated more than 24 documented challenges to his authority, had buried 2 brothers and a number of enemies his record keepers had stopped counting. He had learned from childhood that power was a blade that cut equally whoever held it and whoever received it. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with a close-trimmed dark beard going silver at the edges, and eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Yet he observed everything with a steadiness his council lords read as authority, and his enemies read as coldness. Both were correct. When his head of guard appeared with a slightly off-balance expression, to report that a female prisoner in the holding ward was requesting urgent audience, claiming knowledge of a threat to the king's life, Devon did not look up from the documents on his table. A prisoner. Yes, my lord. Female ward. And her reason? The guard cleared his throat. She says she has information about a threat to your life, my lord. Now Devon looked up. Not with alarm. He had learned not to show alarm. With that particular sharpened attention that meant something had landed on something real. Bring her. Sarah entered the small audience chamber escorted by 2 guards who held her arms as if she might at any moment become dangerous. She had done what she could with what she had, smoothed her worn dress with her hands, retied her hair more carefully, washed her face with the water from the cell jug. There was no hiding that she came from a prison cell, but there were ways to enter a room with dignity, and her father had taught her every one of them. She didn't look at the walls, didn't react to the deep blue packstone tilework, the bronze lanterns, the woven floor covering that looked too fine to walk on. She looked directly at the man seated before her. Devon studied this woman for a long moment without speaking. There was something immediately disorienting about her. Not her appearance, though she was striking, yet not boldness, though she had plenty of that. Something else, an absence. Of the thing he saw in everyone who stood before him. She was not afraid. Or if she was, she had decided the fear would not be given a voice today. Speak, he said. Just that. Sarah opened her hand. The scroll lay in her palm, small, creased at the edges, the red thread still loosely coiled around it. A guard moved to take it. Devon raised one hand slightly. The guard stopped. You, the king said, looking at her. Bring it yourself. A test. She understood that immediately. To approach the Alpha King without explicit invitation was a transgression. But to hesitate would suggest she didn't believe what she was carrying. She walked forward to the appropriate distance, extended the scroll with both hands, the formal gesture, the respectful gesture, like the one her father had shown her once when describing how a document of importance was properly presented to a man of power. Devon took it. Read. The silence in the chamber had texture. She felt the exact moment his eyes reached the final line, because something in the air shifted. The way a cloud covers the sun and the temperature drops, not sharply, but absolutely. He folded the scroll, set it on the table to his left, folded his hands, then looked at her differently than the first time. Before, she had been a prisoner with a story. Now she was something he hadn't yet named. Where did you find this? A wolf cub brought it to my cell, my lord, through the gate bars. It carried the scroll in its mouth. A pause. One of the pack wolves. Yes, they move freely through the upper stronghold, including the council tower. Another pause. Longer. And you can read this. Not a question, a recognition. And in it, something that might have been surprise, if Devon were the kind of man who allowed himself open surprise. My father was Aldrich, the royal scribe, my lord. He died 2 winters ago. Before that, he taught me everything he knew. Devon was still for a moment that stretched longer than it was. Then he stood. Leave us, he said to the guards. The 2 men exchanged the briefest look, the kind that happens when protocol and instinct disagree. But neither questioned the order. They left, and for the first time in years, the Alpha King was alone in a room with a woman who was neither kin, nor bonded mate, nor council member. Tell me everything, he said, from the beginning, every detail. And Sarah told him. She told him about the suggested path, about the suspicion that had grown in her on that first cold night, about the wolf cub and the scroll and the seal she'd recognized, because her father had taught her the symbols of Ironmark authority, the way other parents teach their children the names of stars. Devon listened without interrupting. He had learned long ago that men who interrupted lost half the information. And information was the only thing worth more than strength in a pack court. When she finished, he was quiet. "Why bring this to me?" he said. "You could have kept it. Used it as leverage for your freedom with someone else. There were other ways to use what you found." Sarah looked at him directly. She couldn't help it. It was simply who she was. "Because it would have been wrong," she said. Whatever harm was done to me here was not done by you. It wouldn't be just for you to pay for it." Devon went very still. It was the simplest answer he had received in years of ruling. Perhaps the most honest one. And it disturbed him far more than the conspiracy did. That same afternoon, the king summoned his head of intelligence under absolute silence. That night, 3 of the northern gate guards were quietly replaced and questioned. Before dawn, the conspiracy had been confirmed, and it ran far deeper than a single scroll suggested. Brennan had been building his network for months. Foreign merchants, corrupt provincial governors, informants embedded in the household staff. A web that reached farther than the scroll had revealed. And at the center of that web, the thread that led to Sarah's name. To her father's name. Aldrich the scribe had left records before he died. Records that, if his daughter could read them clearly enough, could one day be used. Brennan had tried to isolate her before that happened. The cruelty of it, that his attempt to silence her had created exactly the conditions for her to speak, was not lost on Sarah when she learned it later. She had been asleep on the cell floor when the key turned in the lock before sunrise. Riva stood on the other side of the gate, wearing an expression the old woman had never used toward any prisoner. Something between astonishment and respect. "Get up," Riva said in a strange voice. "You don't sleep here anymore." The guest quarters of the stronghold were simple by pack standards, but to Sarah, who had slept on stone for 3 days, the wool mattress felt like something from a different world entirely. She sat on the edge of it for a long time, looking out the window at the garden she had tended for 2 years. The same roses, the same stone fountain burbling in the center of the courtyard, the same garden, a completely different world. And somewhere in that vast stronghold, the most powerful alpha in the Packlands was sitting with a confirmed betrayal and the face of a honey-eyed woman who had decided, for no obvious reason of self-interest, to do the right thing. Devon did not sleep that night. Not because of Brennan. Betrayal had come for him enough times to have lost its power to keep him awake. It was something else. A voice, calm and direct, saying, "It would be unjust for you to pay for it." The days that followed were strange in ways Sarah hadn't anticipated. She was not sent away. She was not formally summoned. She existed in the guest quarters in a kind of gilded suspension, served, fed, treated with a courtesy that left the household staff clearly uncertain how to classify her. Not noble, not servant, not consort. Simply, here. On the 3rd day, he appeared without announcement. No the usual retinue of advisors and guards. Just Devon, and 1 personal guard who stayed outside the door. Sarah was seated at the window reading a treatise on medicinal gardens she'd timidly requested from the Stronghold library. She stood when he entered. Correct instinct, respect, not submission. "Sit," he said. And there was something in the tone that was almost not a command. Almost a request. He pulled a chair and sat at a respectful distance, as if the usual architecture of rank had been temporarily set aside by quiet mutual agreement. "How are you?" he asked. Sarah blinked. In every scenario she had imagined for this conversation, that question had not appeared. "Well, my lord, thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I owed you something." A silence. "Lord Brennan has been contained," he said. "The full judgment will come." She nodded, asked no further questions about it. She understood by his tone that this was all that would be said for now. Then he did something unexpected. He looked at the book in her hands. Medicinal Gardens. "My father cultivated herbs," she said. "I learned from him. It's what I know best, besides letters. What do you most like to grow?" It was a small question, almost ordinary. The kind an Alpha King did not ask garden workers. But something in the way he asked it, with genuine curiosity, without the political weight that wrapped every word he spoke in formal settings, made Sarah answer with equal simplicity. "Lavender," she said, "because it grows in difficult soil, and the harder the wind, the stronger the fragrance." Devon looked at her for a moment. "That's an interesting observation," he said slowly. "It's only about plants, my lord." "No," he said, "it isn't." The visits became a pattern neither of them had planned, and neither questioned. He came in the late afternoons, when the council obligations were met, and the stronghold entered that golden hour, when even power seemed to breathe more slowly. He stayed an hour, sometimes two. They talked at first about concrete things, the gardens, the library, the city she had come to know through her father's descriptions. But gradually the conversations deepened, the way a river finds a wider bed. One day he arrived with tension visible in his jaw and shoulders. A difficult decision made that morning. She could see it without being told. She didn't ask what had happened. Instead she said, "My father used to say that the heaviest decisions aren't the ones we carry alone. They're the ones we carry believing we should carry them alone." Devon was quiet for a long time. "Your father was wise," he said finally. "He was only human," she answered, which, given time, is the same thing. There was something Sarah did that no council lord, no general, no pack elder had done for Devon in years of his rule. She listened, not to identify where to agree or disagree for political advantage, and not to prepare her next response while he was still speaking. She listened with complete attention, which is perhaps the rarest and most valuable thing one person can give another. And when she spoke with a frankness that bordered on imprudence, but never crossed into disrespect. One afternoon, he described a taxation decision affecting a struggling region in the outlying pack territories. He expected agreement. It was what he was used to receiving. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "May I say what I think, my lord?" "Why ask if you're going to say it anyway?" he replied. And there was something in that answer, for the first time, unmistakably close to humor. "I think," she said, choosing her words carefully but not retreating from them, "that the stronghold sometimes sees numbers where it should see faces. My father wrote the levy records. I saw what was behind every figure. Families, impossible choices, men selling their tools to pay what was owed." Davon didn't respond immediately. But the following week he sent a direct envoy to the outlying territories to review the local records, something that had not been done in decades. He didn't tell Sarah he had done it. But Riva, who moved through the stronghold with the invisibility of the very old and the long forgotten, knew, and told Sarah, with an expression that mixed astonishment with something very close to pride. What grew between them had no name in the Pack Court's official vocabulary. It was not the arrangement between an Alpha and a favored Omega. There was too much distance, too much equality in the conversations. It was not the formal relationship between a ruler and a council advisor. There was too much of the personal in the shared silences. It was something that existed before titles were invented, before pack hierarchies were built. The recognition of one soul in another. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who feared him or wanted something from him. Sarah did not fear him. She had proven that in the cell. And what she wanted was so simple, it was almost incomprehensible to a man of his world. She only wanted things to be just. There was one afternoon Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. They had been sitting in silence, watching the garden below, where the red roses moved in the wind that came up from the valley. "You know," Devon said without looking at her, "or that I cannot simply let you leave." She turned her face toward him. "I know," she said. "And you know that I'm not the kind of person who stays where she doesn't want to be." He turned then. And in that exchanged look, above the garden that smelled of rose and cold mountain air, they both understood, without needing to say more, what was happening between them. The judgment of Lord Brennan lasted 3 days. Sarah was not present. It would not have been appropriate, and she hadn't asked to be. but Riva kept her informed with the precision of someone who had spent decades observing the corridors of power from a position of perfect invisibility. The sentencing was confirmed on the third day. Brennan had not only conspired against the Alpha King's life, the network beneath him included foreign traders, corrupt provincial governors, and a chain of informants that reached into the stronghold's own household staff. The scale of the betrayal was enough to make the blood run cold. And within that web, the thread that led back to Sarah, to her father's name. Aldrich had left certain records before his death. Ledgers, documents, the kind that, in the right hands and with sharp enough eyes, could expose what Brennan had been doing for years before the conspiracy fully formed. Brennan had maneuvered Sarah into prison, hoping to neutralize her before she understood what she held. The bitter irony that in trying to silence her, he had placed the evidence directly in her path, was not lost on either of them. The morning after the sentencing, Devon came to the guest quarters. Something in his posture was different. The tension of a man who has prepared himself to say something important and is still uncertain how to begin. Sarah waited. "The judgment is complete," he said. "I heard." "You're free," he said. "That was always true. But now it's formally documented. Your records have been prepared. You can return to the city, reclaim your father's house, receive proper restitution for what was done to you." Sarah listened to all of this in silence. "That's just," she said. "It's the minimum," he replied. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He paused, and for the first time across all of their conversations, Devon Ironmark looked, only slightly, almost imperceptibly, uncertain. "But there is another possibility I'd like to offer you." She looked at him. "Not as Alpha King," he said, in a voice that had dropped to a register she had never heard from him before. "As a man who has spent the last weeks understanding what it is to have someone he can actually talk to." The garden was quiet below them. The valley stretched silver in the distance. "You're not commanding me," she said slowly. "No," he said. "I'm asking." She didn't answer immediately, and he, the man who had commanded armies, decided the fate of territories, sent and received envoys from every corner of the known packlands, waited without impatience. Without pressure, simply waited. And it was in that waiting that Sarah found her answer. Because she had learned something in the gardens, between the lavender and the roses, that the things which grow strongest are not the ones planted in easy soil. They are the ones that find honest ground, however hard, so I can decide to put down roots anyway. "I'll stay," she said. "But not as ornament, my lord. I'll stay as I am." Devon looked at her for a long moment. "That would be the only reason worth asking," he said. What followed was not a story the way children understand stories, with fanfare and a golden ending that arrives in a single day. It was something more real, more difficult, and more beautiful than any fanfare could hold. Sarah became part of the Ironmark stronghold in a way the Pack Court had no proper language for. Not only a bonded mate, though she became that too, in a ceremony Devon insisted on keeping simpler than his council lords expected, and more sincere than those walls had seen in decades. She was his counsel, his interlocutor, the voice that said what no lord of the council dared. And she didn't sit in the formal assemblies. The world was not yet ready for that. But there was a smaller chamber adjacent to the Alpha's hall, where she read the reports he brought her, where the two of them worked through the difficult decisions with the same directness as those first conversations in the guest quarters. The decisions that came out of that room were different. The council lords noticed, without quite knowing where the change came from, that Alpha King Devon had developed in his later years an unusual capacity to see past numbers to the people behind them, to listen before deciding, to balance strength with something that looked almost like mercy. The historians would attribute it to the maturity of his rule. Those who lived inside the stronghold knew the truth. Children came in time. 3 of them, or each carrying something of both parents. The eldest daughter had her mother's honey-colored eyes and her father's quiet iron. The middle son had Sarah's curiosity and Devon's remarkable memory. The youngest was pure laughter, and that, they agreed, belonged entirely to himself. Sarah raised them the way Aldrich had raised her. She taught them to read before she taught them to speak formally, to listen before judging, to understand that real authority was not the capacity to impose, it was the capacity to comprehend. Davin watched all of this with the same attention that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him, and kept learning, even after all those years. There was an afternoon when Sarah's hair had begun to silver at the temples, and the lines of Davon's face had deepened past what they had been in the days of the prison cell, sign when the two of them sat in the same garden where they had first exchanged that true look. The roses were still there. The valley still stretched silver beyond the walls. "You know," Davon said, in the tone she had learned over decades to recognize as the tone of real things, "I think about that wolf cub sometimes." Sarah smiled. "So do I." "Do you think it was chance?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think," she said slowly, "that chance is just the name we give to things we don't know how to be grateful for." Davon looked at her then, and the man who had ruled one of the great pack kingdoms of the age, who had survived more challenges to his power than his record keepers had tracked, who had made decisions that moved the lives of thousands, that man smiled. Completely. Without reservation. Without politics. The kind of smile that only exists when a person is exactly where they are supposed to be. Alpha King Davin Ironmark ruled until the last day of his life. Those who studied his reign in the years after would wonder at a particular quality of it, a capacity to balance power and humanity, strength and gentleness, in a way that seemed to deepen rather than diminish with age. They would look for the answer in the formal records, in the council scrolls, in the military logs and the taxation ledgers. They would not find it there, because the answer was somewhere else. It was in a woman with honey-dark eyes, who had been locked away for a rule she didn't know, and who received a packwolf's secret in her palm, and who decided, when staying silent would have been the safer choice, to do the right thing. It was in the late afternoon conversations. In the garden that smelled of lavender and rose. It was in every question she had asked that no council lord had dared. It was in the steady, unbreakable heart of a scribe's daughter who discovered, without ever planning to, that the most powerful way to change a pack was not through strength or strategy. It was through truth, spoken calmly, and love, offered without condition. And so ends the story of Sarah and the Alpha King, the woman they locked away forever, who, because of a wolf cub and a heart that refused to be small, rewrote the fate of an entire pack. If this story reached something in you, share it. Let it travel further than it came. Every view, every share, every act of kindness helps another story find the ears it was meant for.